don't think I am more superstitious than the general run of men, and I know I am no believer in table waltzing, wall rapping sort of spiritualism, but I did once run across a queer thing not to be explained on natural grounds. I am a native of England, and for 7 or 8 years of my early manhood served in the Royal Navy as a lieutenant. In 1866, I sailed in the Princess Alice, where I first became acquainted with a young fellow a little older than myself, named, or I shall call him, Freeman Lovelace. While I cannot say I ever conceived any real affection for him, we became rather good friends. As such friendships go, he was so clever, full of good stories, had seen much of life, though perhaps too much of its worst side, and was well liked by all on board. He was just the sort of man that women love to infatuation and throw themselves away on it. And from what he would sometimes, in confidential words, let drop, I fancied he was pretty much entangled in half a dozen different directions ashore. When we left on the cruise I tell you of, I thought then he seemed to have something on his mind, and once I saw him tear up some letters he had, and heard him murmur several times, "Poor girl, poor girl." But this unwanted seriousness wore away in a week or two, and I thought nothing more of it. But one night, when he and I had just parted for the night, and I had started for my cabin, he called me back. "Trescott," he said, "did a woman pass you just now?" I looked at him in amazement. We were 200 miles from any woman, and he knew it. "A woman," I echoed. "Why, how should a woman come aboard the Princess Alice?" "Oh, all right," he answered lightly, although I could see by the binnacle lamp that his face was singularly colorless. It must have been imagination that made me think I saw someone in women's dress steal out the shadow of the mast there. Good night. We were to touch at Gibraltar, Malaga, and Barcelona as we entered the Mediterranean, and it was the first of 3 ports that the next of the series of extraordinary events I have to relate took place. We had passed the mighty fortress and lay at anchor near the town when Lovelace and I got leave to go ashore for a couple of hours. As we passed along a street lined with houses, closely shuttered as it was noontide, I noticed a woman half concealed by the pillars of a church. I was just about to call the attention of my companion to the fact that she seemed to be an Englishwoman, and that her quiet English costume seemed out of place in this essentially foreign town, when I saw him start back and turn pallid. I caught him thinking him faint, but soon saw that it was unmistaken terror. What struck me as strange was the fact of the unusual intentness of her face, fixed and movable on Lovelace, and that she held her hand to her throat in a way that concealed it from view. In another moment, Lovelace seemed to rally and startled forward with a cry of, "Lucy, you here," on his lips. But as my eyes went from him back to the spot not 30 feet away where the girl had stood, I saw that she was gone. My companion now became excited. "Where did she go?" he asked. I was as much puzzled as he, for it was hardly possible that she could, in that mere moment of time, have gained one of the adjacent houses, or have gone down the street unseen by us. Indeed, in both directions there was no one in sight. There was only the church. But entering, we were confronted by a priest speaking very fair English, who assured us that no one had entered the edifice within the last hour. I was, as I have said, puzzled by this, but thought nothing of any supernatural element it might have. Lovelace, on the contrary, returned at once to the ship, and for days secluded himself from all companionship. When we reached Malaga, he did not wish to go ashore, but the commander of the ship detailed him, together with 3 others, to carry a dispatch to the consul at that port. I remained aboard, but the others returning, I heard what was designated as a queer story on Lovelace. It seems that he, with the rest of the party, stopped on the street to buy some fruit, when all at once the fruit seller's little child cried out in terror. Something about a woman in black that was standing just behind Lovelace. All looked around, but could see nobody there, and they went on choosing the fruit, when the child gave another still louder shriek and fell down. Its mother picked it up, and the little fellow clung to her, sobbing out that the woman had taken her hand from her throat, and that it was all bloody. As there was plainly no such woman about, the young officers would have laughed at the child's fancy, but Lovelace had been obliged to borrow the fruit seller's child, so agitated was he for some minutes. He looked as white and weak as a woman, concluded my informant. On getting to Barcelona, Lovelace refused to leave the ship, but during the day there arrived an invitation from a mutual friend of his and mine, whose yacht was laying there, to dine with him, and after some difficulty succeeded in getting Lovelace to consent to go. We spent a pleasant hour aboard Lord X's beautiful craft, and were just going into dinner. Lady X on Lovelace's arm, when all at once that lady gave a scream and looked around in haste, only to scream again and faint dead away. I stared with amazement with the rest of the guests, but just beyond Lovelace I saw the woman in black, standing quietly gazing into my friend's face. Then she slowly dropped that still flowed in heavy, sullen drops. I understood then what made Lady X faint. Though when she recovered her consciousness and tried to combat her husband's and friend's attempt to persuade her that the woman had existed only in her imagination, I kept silent, and so did Lovelace, from whom, fortunately, attention had been attracted in the stir over our fair hostess. She had felt, she said, an ice-like hand on her arm, and looking about, had seen the ghostly figure I have described. When we got back to the ship that night, I put aside the reserve I had hitherto maintained. When we got back to the ship that night, I put aside the reserve I had hitherto maintained towards Lovelace on this subject, and asked him for an explanation. He was very much embarrassed, and I have never known whether he told me the whole truth or not. At any rate, this was his story. His sister, whom he had visited in London before starting on his cruise, had had a deceased Church of England clergyman's daughter employed as a nursery governess for her children, and in his idle moments Lovelace had amused himself by making love to this poor girl. He swore he went no further than this, but that was a question as to the amount of confidence one could put in the man. At last, as the time drew near for him to sail, he had tried to withdraw from his flirtation, when the girl exhibited a despair and grief for which he was not prepared, and declared that if he proved faithless to her, she would kill herself. Not believing this threat, he saw her no more, and left for his cruise, without a farewell word to her. He knew as yet nothing of her fate, and had his apprehensions only aroused by seeing her that memorable night in the Bay of Biscay, looking at him from near the mast. From what had happened, since he could not help but believe she had fulfilled her desperate threat, resolved on reaching Naples to know the truth, he telegraphed to his sister to know what had become of Miss Raymond. She replied coldly, with a plain intimation that she disliked his manifest interest in her poor dependent, that on the day he had sailed, Miss Raymond had been found in her room with that across her throat which he had hardly cared to see. On learning this, for some time Lovelace acted like a thoroughly broken man, but after a while began somewhat to recover. We were still at Naples when the end came to the retribution that followed his heartlessness. Though I had taken a real dislike to the man after hearing his story, we were still much thrown together, and one evening we had gone to call on some English ladies at the consul's. We had taken our leave, but on one of the ladies, to whom Lovelace had been paying some rather zealous attention, appearing on a balcony above, he stood up in the open carriage we occupied to catch the flowers she half-mockingly threw down at him. All at once he turned his laughing eyes on me, and as he did, I saw his face freeze suddenly. With the horror I knew so well, he started backward, and at the same moment the horses reared slightly, and before I could catch him, he had fallen from the carriage into the street. joined the driver. He was bending over Lovelace'S dead body. He had broken his neck on the stones. Some days after,